Hey everyone, module number 8, child psychology. Let's get into the genetics. So what we will be covering in genetics is how genetics and the information and the environment work together in development, genes, chromosomes, and DNA, how the environment might affect genetics and genetics abnormalities and their effects on the development, psychological conditions that are genetic. So we'll be covering somewhat all of these 5 objectives, hopefully. Um, if you have ever working through this course in order, so you know that the last module you attended is the teenage years in terms of the cognitive development. Now, in this order that now you're reaching the part, module number 8, which is genetics, you're now aware of the child's cognitive development from birth all the way to adulthood. As we have discussed that the cognitive development starts from the infancy. And at this point of the course, we will change some of the gears and get in a very little bit of different directions and to start looking at the role of genetics play in child psychology, because I think it's important factor to look at it, that how genes play its part in child psychology. Before we get too far into that, I think it's important to cover some of the basic understanding of genetics and how genetics might affect psychology in children. So we will also be touch upon the nature versus nurture. I'm not sure if it's nature versus nurture, because I think nature and nurture comes from the same source. And so I don't want to put one against the other, which most of the psychologists agree now that there's a major role of both being playing its part. Which will further in module number 9. So that will be an interesting one as well. An overview of genetics, psychology, and development. How is child development determined? Though it's virtually impossible to know all about it, that what really contributes to this development, but we can look at some of the important factors, some of the influential factors in the development. And of course, one of them would be the role of genetics. So by taking a look at the role of genetics and other factors to play in child's development, researchers can identify how this contributes to their development. Each of these influences can be looked at as building blocks, though most of the people have the same basic blocks to create all who they are. The blocks can be put together in infinite ways. Think of your own body, for example, and think for a minute and see how much of your body is part of the genetics and how much is your body is part of the experiences you had. So and that's how, like, you could see by reviewing yourself to see the difference between the two. This has been a question that has been sought by and continue to be studied by psychologists, philosophers, educators, and that has been the centuries long question. And of course, the debate continues. Today, however, like that I was saying earlier, majority of the researchers agree that the development involves an interaction between genetics and the environment. So nature and nurture has a beautiful intersection. So though our genetics strongly influence some parts of development, there is also an environmental aspects that play their role. For example, when children go through puberty, it is primarily based on genetics. However, there are environmental factors such as nutrition, which also can affect. So even when a child is in the womb, the environment plays a part. Even though the genetic gives the child the blueprint of development, the environment can influence and impact how the blueprint is interpreted. So, for instance, a child who has a mother, a mother who uses, for example, drugs during pregnancy, will likely to have issues with her own genetic blueprint that uses during the uh, during the to be part of that blueprint, right? So the part of that development. So if the mom is using drugs during the pregnancy, it is likely that there are issues that are going to be part of the genetic blueprint is used in the development. So, and this is due to, of course, on the environmental factor. The drugs affect how the blueprint is being read. So nature versus nurture, or nature and nurture, is an extremely complex situation, and we will continue to further discuss nature and nurture in the next module, number 9. So for now, we're clear that genetics is playing a part in the development. So let's look at the early stage of development. To fully understand the role of genetics play in our psychology, we must go back to the very beginning with the male and female reproductive cells. So how does the environment influence genetic expression? So now you might wonder how these instructions influence how children develop and how they determine what traits they have. So to fully understand this, it is essential that to first understand and distinguish between child's genetics and actual expression that comes from these genes. So the term that is used to describe all of the genes that a person inherits from the parents is called genotype. And how these genes are expressed is called phenotypes. So these, for example, the phenotype include the physical traits that we can see, such as the eye color, the height, and as well as the non-physical aspect of our personality, such as being either extrovert or shy. The genotype, on the other hand, will represent how a child grows up, and the way building blocks are put together will determine the genes are expressed. Sound confusing, but one easy way to think about it is to compare this to like a building a house. Now, to build a house, you can use the same blueprint of one house to build another house. So when you using the blueprint of one house to build another home, that home can be different in many regards. It would be similar, but not the same. So for example, you can use the same blueprint and have that the original blueprint is, for example, brown roof, gray walls. And then when you're building a new one, it will be similar, but not the same. You could have the color theme would be perhaps gray shingles and brown walls, or something to that effect. So, and that's how these are translated. The factors that influence the way genes are expressed. Not all genes are expressed. Whether or not it is expressed will depend on two things. Number one, the interaction between gene and environment, and the interaction between individual gene with other genes. So keep in mind, the factors that influence the way genes are expressed, it depends on two things: how genes are interacting with one another, right, with other genes, and how gene is interacting with the environment in itself. We'll look into that a little bit deeper. So number one is the interaction between genes and environment, right? So we said there are two things that that we want to look at. One is how the genes are interacting between the gene and the environment. So the environment that a fetus is exposed to, both in the womb as well as they grow, will impact how the genes are expressed. One example is the height. Though the genetics determine how tall a child will be, a person will be, the actual height is expressed and can be suppressed due to environmental factors such as chronic illness or poor nutrition. You see, so you could see, although the genetics is giving you the blueprint for the child to have, for example, what height he or she has, can have, but it can be suppressed by the environmental factors. So we looked at the we looked at the genes between the genes and the environment, the interaction. But now we look at the interaction between the genes. So sometime a gene will contain conflicting information with another gene. When this happens, one gene battles it out with another, and the winning gene will express its traits over the other gene. Other gene will work in an additive way. So if there are conflicting genes, information, then the one gene will try to fight or battle with the other gene. And by doing so, if it overcomes, then the other gene will work as an additive in an additive way, right? So the example would be, if a child has one parent very tall and the other parent very short, the genes of the child might come together and split the difference, so making the child an average height adult, because there's a conflicting information in the genes, a tall parent and a short parent. There are also cases where two genes might have conflicting information, and the one is more dominant than the other. For example, in the case of eye color. So a gene of a brown eye is a dominant gene, right? And the gene of a blue eyes is a recessive gene. If the child gets a dominant brown gene, eye gene from one parent, and a recessive blue eye gene from another parent, this means the child will have the brown eyes, right? Because the brown eyes parent is the dominant gene, and the dominant gene comes over the recessive gene, and that's how the child will have most likely the brown eyes. So just quickly, we went over interaction between the genes. We went over the interaction between the genes and the environment. So now let's look at how genetic abnormalities affect the development process, right? Even though that genes come with directions, right? So the genes come with directions. As with anything in life, things can go wrong. Things can happen that can affect these, right? That can affect these directions. Sometimes, for instance, when 23 chromosomes come from a male and a 23 comes from a female, so set 23 chromosomes from a male and 23 from a female, they come together and the process of them combining goes wrong. So they're supposed to have 23, 23. They came together, but the process in itself, something went wrong with the process. When this happens, the resulting cell might have more or fewer chromosomes than it should. This happens so often that the researchers believe that that about half of the formed zygotes, which is the name for the group of cells that are eventually formed into a fetus, have more or less than 23 required chromosomes. Most of them, however, are naturally aborted by the body, and the mother never even realizes that its occurrence. And in some cases, however, a fetus does form with abnormal number of chromosomes. When this happens, a resulting child has conditions that is determined based on which chromosome is affected, right? So now we're pretty clear that there are 23 male and 23 female chromosomes coming together to develop a fetus. Either the number can go wrong or the process in itself can go wrong, and that could have consequences. Sharing some of the example. An example of this that everyone would know is the case of Down syndrome. In this case, in the Down syndrome case, the 21st chromosome has 3 copies instead of 2, right? So we know the 21st chromosome for a male and a female makes it into a pair. That makes it 2. Instead of 2, there are 3, right? So if there are 3 copies of those, which supposed to be 2, this condition is characterized by specific facial characteristics, such as slanted eyes, round face, tongue is thicker than it should be. There are also might be issues such as hearing problem, heart defects. Almost all people with Down syndrome have some form of intellectual impairment, and some severity, and some of the severity can vary greatly. So we know one thing for sure: the genotype refers to sets of genes a person has. A phenotype, on the other hand, is the physical traits that we can see, such as the eye color, hair color, personality type. So when it's genotype, we know the sets of genes the person has. The phenotypes is when we can see the personality, we can see the hair color, and so on and so forth. So now we'll look at the abnormalities with sex chromosomes. In addition to the 23 chromosome that the male and the female cells bring to the table to create zygote, there are also sex chromosomes that these cells carry. So a female cell always has an X chromosome, and a male cell has an X or a Y chromosome, which determines if the child gender is male or female. So as with the other chromosome, there is a small possibility that there will be abnormalities with the sex chromosome. So in about 1 in every 500 births, a child is missing either a sex chromosome or carries an additional or an extra one, right? So there's supposed to be an X and a Y, right? So for example, XX or XY, right? So female always have X, male X or Y. But in every 500 births, there's a child who's missing sex chromosome and or carries another one. An example is the Klinefelter syndrome, and which is caused by having an extra X chromosome, right? Which is the condition characterized by lack of secondary sex characteristics and learning disabilities. Fragile X syndrome is another example. In this case, an X chromosome is attached to another chromosome. This can affect both males and females. And there are various effects. Some people with the condition will not show any signs of the condition, and others might have severe mental challenges or mental retardation. A person with Fragile X syndrome can fall anywhere on that spectrum. You can have the signs and you may not have the signs and could have some serious mental retardation. So Turner syndrome is the third example for that. So in the Turner syndrome case, it occurs when there's only one sex chromosome present. So in Turner syndrome can only appear in females, as there is only Y chromosome present. So this condition might result in short stature, lack of sensory sex characteristics, and the look of a webbed neck. There are also psychological impairments that are associated with this condition, including learning disabilities and emotional issues. So now we will look at the genetic psychological conditions. Though not all psychological conditions are genetic, there are some that fall into this category. Now, these includes, for example, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, depression, ADHD, ASD, attention spectrum disorder. This means that children born to a parent who has these conditions, who has schizophrenia, bipolar, depression, attention, ADHD, and ASD, if a child is born to that parent with this condition, he or she is at the risk of developing these conditions themselves. They're at the risk of developing these conditions. Though anyone can develop these conditions, right? So we wanted to make sure that anyone can develop these, but there's a genetic link between developing these conditions when there's a parent who has these conditions. In conclusion, as you can see through this module, genetics play a significant role in how a child develops. Like genes play an important role. However, you must remember that the role of genetics play is only part of the puzzle. It's not the whole thing. There are several other factors such as culture, education, parenting, social relationship. They also play an important part in child's development. This basic overview of genetics should give you a reasonable basis for the next module, which is the nature versus nurture. And the information you may have learned will be useful throughout the rest of the course, as we have changed the gears from cognitive development to moving into the genes and nature versus nurture and the social development and so on and so forth. So finally, congratulations once again, everybody, completing the module number 8 in child psychology. Once again, my name is Nadeem Sikander, dr.nsikander@gmail.com. God bless you all. Have a wonderful rest of the night and the weekend. Thank you.